Nothing, and Hearth. Genesis for the Aquarian Age. Daze 7, Part 1. The song Lucky 7 is just one such example of remote writing. Creation experienced through art. The EA being given the ID Lou Lewis in this particular example. Artists are all mediums, more often than not, unconscious remote streaming. Remote implies surrounded by water as a protection. Was not your castle, your cast L, surrounded by water until you birthed in a bay? This being a hospital bay for the physical experience. I digress. To return to the topic that artists are mediums, let us now examine the indirect sequential communication. As I have already mentioned, Bruckner and his symphonies is the medium that has been the link I have been given. I have explained how this communication began intuitively. That is the guide and direct approach, but these symphonies need a further medium in the form of physical embodiment. This is the conductor and orchestra. With Bruckner, there are numerous professionals, performing artists that give the music score life. Although coming into this in more recent years, enter the Romanian-born conductor Sergio Celibidache and the Munich Philharmonic Orchestra. Celibidache is a very individual conductor. Often his style is referred to as idiosyncratic. His vision and grasp of the entirety of Bruckner's symphonies simply resonated more than any other conductor. With Celibidache, you are guaranteed genuine live performances in recordings, as he flatly refused to make studio recordings. If you listen carefully, sometimes you can even hear his voice as he issues instructions to the orchestral players. To me, this reminds me of the human aspect to all of this. I feel that the human aspect, in its collective energy as an audience, was a factor in Celibidache's refusal to make studio recordings. Clearly, the energy flow was to confirm that intuition. This wonderful conductor is very spiritual, and his commentary on music reflects this. His words mirror spiritual awakening testimony. His words on rehearsals is also something we can apply to our lives. And I quote, "What is a rehearsal? It is, of course, only a labour of memory of cognition. A rehearsal is not music. A rehearsal is the sum of countless no's." End quote. Those so-called mistakes we experience in life and are our rehearsals in life. Celibidache offers some extremely profound words of wisdom. Quote, "We always think that there's an interpretation. An interpretation of what? How can you interpret a landscape? If you have to go from Plön to Uten, are there interpretations, or do you have to come up with the lakes, the forests, the pathways, and so on?" End quote. From, quote, "Here to there are particulars that are anchored in your consciousness. You cannot interpret them, you can only experience them, and that's the difference." End quote. Celibidache's commentary on conducting reads like a spiritual awakening. And I quote, "I had my theories, but not the actual experience. I knew that such things were possible eventually, but I'd never experienced it." End quote. So his years of music, quote, "was simply pure pleasure. I experienced the end at the beginning. That is, the timelessness, I mean, and afterwards I couldn't go back. I kept going." End quote. I'm sure that this will resonate with you with regard to your spiritual growth. Hear also what this conductor has to say to musicians. Again, the spiritual message is wisdom. Addressing violin players, quote, "You cannot just look where your fingers go, you have to hear it within you," end quote. He continues, quote, "Before we hear, the conceivability of the sound is most important. How should it sound? It is the same for you," that's the violinists, "because your fingers alone will never find it," end quote. Speaking now of music, his commentary applies as much to spiritual awakening. Quote, "It is an absolute unconventional leap. That is, it happens in the mind. The conceivability of the sound is what's most important," end quote. In other words, to have an open mind, we also need to open our heart and create an alignment of mind and heart. To continue addressing the violinists, quote, "One thing is clear for sure. If you cannot conceive the sound in your mind, your fingers will never be able to hit it," end quote. So we can see that feeling is internal. Before it can be expressed externally, this is the difference in words. The same words that describe sensory perception as internal and external. And it also indicates direction of the energy flow. This is what "go within" means. Sergio Celibidache describes intent and observes the external effect he creates from his inner spirit. Quote, "As long as I find it beautiful, it is a personal matter. But when I find myself in you, when you tell me, I think it's beautiful too, that gets closer to the truth because it originated in you as well." End quote. As well, a swell, expanding consciousness, in other words. To continue and to quote, "If you say that's it, then I know you've transcended the moment of beauty," end quote. Sergio's thoughts on conducting are also a guide to the experience of life. Quote, "Memory is what leads to routine. Still to this day I conduct a symphony that I've conducted maybe 2,000 times already. Before the concert, the evening before, I take the score and I read it as if I had never seen it before. Aha, how beautiful, yes, and that too. I get away from everything that could arise from memory, for nothing hampers the spontaneous mindset of a fresh approach more than routine, symbolism, memory, knowledge, etc." End quote. And of Bruckner, Celibidache has this to say, quote, "I don't think Bruckner can be understood. He can only be experienced. If you experience Bruckner, then there's something of his greatness in each of us. That he awakens that in us, and that behind that notion is the absolute power of the Almighty as he felt it, and that he was able to put it in notes. Of that absolute power, Celibidache notes, we live in a godless era, but if we can see and touch, is that all? It is incredible. We all have it, but in most it is underdeveloped." End quote. Now the boundaries of music and spiritual awakening merge in his commentary. Quote, "It's a physical strain, not a mental one. And then what other composer is there with such intellectual capital that every performance necessitates another performance? We play it over and over and rediscovered it each time. That is not with intellect, but as an experience. It's like a cog in a cosmic motor that was missing at a certain spot. After we put the cog in, you realise, aha, that is what was missing. It is an absolute cohesion. Then there is something else that is really unexplainable. You cannot do more than just let it happen. You make sure nothing gets in the way that could hinder this wonderful process. So simultaneously, incredibly active and incredibly passive. You don't want anything, you just let it happen." End quote. To subsequently read such words only confirms my intuition and hunch that my path is to include the medium of spirit in Bruckner through Celibidache. His words echo my spiritual awakening experience that came from the inner work for which I am grateful to have been guided to be able to testify and share from these sources of source manifest as man, as Bruckner and as Celibidache. God became man so that man can become God. From my perspective, yes, as artists, I feel the reader can see that this perfectly illustrates God, which takes many forms through artists. Consider also how many artists had difficult life experiences against all odds, their great works being their path and sole purpose. And you can read the word soul as in the singular sense, as in the spiritual sense. I feel it clear to say that the driving force and creative power can only truly be source. If you cannot see the letter C and the E, the energy, without such in the word source, all that is left is sour. For whatever reason, Celibidache never made any live recordings of the 4 earliest Bruckner symphonies, these being the 00, the Study Symphony, Die Nulter, and the first and second symphonies. So we have to look elsewhere for these. There is a huge choice of conductors and orchestras, but again, it cannot be any more than intuition and communication of feeling of spirit that led me to a second conductor. I was most drawn to Stanislaw Skroweczski, a Polish-born conductor and composer. As I write this, I know little about this conductor except for a recent discussion I had with someone who had written to Skroweczski. The impression I had was confirmed. This man was a gentleman who had not allowed fame to dismiss enthusiasm. This conductor did not reply by letter, but took time to personally telephone the appreciative listener from New York to London, and I understand that the telephone call was nearly an hour. Without prior knowledge of such, the only factor can only be intuition and trust in the process of spirit. It was certainly no disappointment. Here with Skroweczski, we get a very, very different sounds from the same Bruckner symphonies. This gives me enhanced and broader comprehension of this sound world of Bruckner and what Bruckner was trying to convey. God's composer, as Bruckner became referred to, only gave one official name to his Symphony No. 4, the Romantische, the Romantic. But as musical creations take on a life of their own in the external world, so does attached names. An example of this is Beethoven's pair of Opus 27 piano sonatas, which have the published title Quasi una Fantasia. It was a poet who described the second of the sonatas as being like observing the moon shining upon Lake Lucerne in Switzerland, and so today the name Moonlight Sonata came into the musical history. These applied posthumous names can endure or become forgotten. Casting my mind back to Celibidache's years of music and how he found that timelessness experiencing the end at the beginning, I find that in this experience that I echo these words from intuition and stepping into this new world. My first experience was Symphony No. 9 that had gained the name Farewell. The same can be said of his eighth, his last completed symphony, that became referred to as the Apocalyptic. That was another symphony I was to become acquainted with early on. Sorry about that. The word apocalyptic generally seems to be held as something negative, images of fire and brimstone and total destruction, implying an end. So my Bruckner experience has also been to experience that timelessness and experience the end at the beginning. It is when we take into consideration that regional accents, dialects, and a synthesis of language hides a vowel shift, a vowel to L, the spell changing the sound and altering meaning. Think of the word hair and hair, for example, as in H-A-I-R and H-I-E-R and also A-I-R. So if we listen carefully and take no negative thought, Jesus said, take no thought. Matthew 6:31-33. Perhaps you will hear epoch collapse, implying the end of an age as opposed to apocalypse. So it can also be seen that in positive light, the natural but unspoken implication is also the start of something new. What an exciting wonder of unknown potential. That is, of course, going to be created by letting go of old beliefs, fears of the unknown. So you could say, as one door closes, another door opens. Would you not agree that this perspective totally changes how we view things from new eyes? That is to say, eyes in a collective sense, as the view is in the mind's eye. Is that not surely the foundation stone of spiritual awakening? After all, was I in any life-threatening danger by stepping into the unknown? My testimony from this experience, both in Bruckner's music and at the spiritual level, is that this has only benefited me. Although the external vessel may look little different than it did, albeit a little greyer and older, internally I feel a very different being. What, though, has this path done? Certainly it has not helped me to find the end, but it has helped me to know myself in ways the external cannot, or even seems willing to do so. That same system that seems intent to prevent such certainly seems also to separate me from something that is against divine eternal law. That is to sever the connection, to create separation of self from the Alpha and the Omega. In that, to my very core, is a resounding feeling there is good over evil. Perhaps it is not too much of a leap to say that I love Bruckner's symphonies, and that love conquers all. As I write this, in my mind, I can hear a song by Toya, Brave New World. Worth hearing those lyrics if you do not know this song. What also became clear is that this revelation creates a new age within. In its most positive way, I can say this is a new world order. It is said that the devil is in the detail, and this material realm seems to adopt that path in the name of science, a seance that seems to wish to get to that spark that creates, no doubt to mock and imitate. Such a path cannot end well, as source is infinite outside of the material realm and yet within it unseen. That is the mystery of Golgotha. Wagner's words echo, quote, They made us speculate on existing instead of getting on with existing." End quote. Here then is another example of the Red Priest influence casting its shadow. The perceived evil in 4 seasons, but only half the truth, a half picture of the trial between harmony and invention. We do adopt that same scientific approach, albeit in a very different intent, this being to co-create with Source, not to subjugate or to masquerade as being Source itself. So when we go within, it is purely to know oneself as a co-creator, our personalized universe, a microcosm of the macrocosm, our very own orchestra and conductor, the composer, the true artist that we really are inside. That Red Priest shadow would pull these words apart and shine a false light on my creation, advocating Wagner and a new world order in their community standards world of the material. Ask yourself this: from what you have already read here, do these words suggest the programmed and weaponized word attachments that would imply something dictatorial, Nazi or so-called elite agendas? Here then is the significant difference between the reactions of the man-made, of lower conscious, as opposed to the higher self response. Here also is free will, and for you to reflect and know how you feel from what you have read thus far. Perhaps a fulcrum point, whether you feel you wish to keep reading or to dismiss this. Before you now is that right to exercise or exorcise your free will and close a door or open it and see where it leads. Right now I cannot tell you, for I of myself know nothing. I of myself can do nothing, just like a conductor alone cannot bring forth musical sounds. For that we require an embodiment, the orchestra. And that concludes part 1 of Daze 3. I should point out that when I commenced the recording of Daze 3, I noted that the time was 11:44. These things just keep repeating, as does the total time of this.